You can go out right now and commit some heinous sin, and probably like a piano is not going to fall on you from the sky, like in Looney Tunes. And
Right.
you might think, "Huh, oh, I guess there's no consequences."
Yeah.
It's like Eve takes the fruit, right? The serpent gets her to take it, and she kind of looks at it and like nothing happened. Looks good, so maybe I can just get away with this.
But the point, though, I think of the whole lesson is going to be, well, just like in Job, it's like no matter what circumstances you find yourself in, you always do the right
Mhm.
thing. Welcome to Biblocus, where the Bible intersects with your life. I'm Timothy,
And I'm Caleb.
and you're listening to Bible Discussions, the forum where we explore biblical topics that are relevant to your life. Now, today we are continuing our series entitled, Who is Jesus Christ and Why Do I Need Him? And we're going to be looking at the Old Testament book of Habakkuk.
It's a fun one to say.
Yeah, I got it out somehow. How long must we wait for God's justice is the main theme we're going to be looking at there. And in the New Testament, we're going to look at God's justice is coming into the world through Jesus Christ. Now, our alternate opening this morning could have easily been, welcome to another episode of The Unknown Prophet, because we're going to talk about Habakkuk, and we don't know a whole lot about him from any other biblical passages. I'd be willing to bet, though, that no one in your grade school was named Habakkuk. So I think I might win that bet most dinner parties. So this book, though, it's presented as a dialogue between God and Habakkuk, the prophet, and he's asking him the age-old question of, like, why does evil stuff happen? Kind of the idea. But Caleb, as a historian, do you have any background you can give us on Habakkuk? How do we figure this out?
Like a lot of them, it just kind of starts by throwing his name out there, and that's it. So in this case, we're just going to jump in, and we'll discover some context along the way that can give us some hints.
Okay, so Habakkuk 1:1-4. The prophecy that Habakkuk the prophet received. How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you, violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted. So looking at this, we can see that Habakkuk is seeing terrible, violent acts and things of oppression going on against him, but he's a prophet, and so his thing is he's supposed to call everybody back to, the covenant, back to the law, and his problem is that that's all broken.
Yeah.
Right? He's saying, well, Lord, but the law is paralyzed, justice doesn't prevail, the wicked are hemming in the righteous, and justice is perverted. So he's like, why am I supposed to call people back to that? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, when are you going to straighten all this stuff and turn it all back right side up? So who is doing this, Caleb? We don't have any idea yet, right?
Yeah, we're going to get to that here in the next part of it.
Okay.
So in verses 5-11, God replies to Habakkuk, "Look at the nations and watch, and be utterly amazed. For I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people, who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swooping to devour. They all come intent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They mock kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all fortified cities. By building earthen ramps, they capture them. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on. Guilty people whose strength is their God."
So that's going to answer who is oppressing Habakkuk at the beginning there. It's the Assyrians.
Yeah, because God's going to raise up the Babylonians. So just like in Nahum, right? Nahum is prophesying the downfall of Nineveh, the great city of Assyria, which fell in 612. So we know he was prophesying shortly before that, probably the mid 7th century. And Habakkuk is in a very similar position here. Could be around the same time. Could be a contemporary of Nahum. But we know it had to be at the latest before the Battle of Carchemish in 605. So Nineveh falls in 612, but Assyria keeps moving the capital and then getting it sacked. And finally, Carchemish falls. That's the last. That's it. They're done after that.
Hmm.
So they did linger a bit after 612. So he's probably writing somewhere in that last couple of decades of the 600s BC.
Yeah. Yeah. And then that's Nebuchadnezzar on the rise there. He's out fighting for his dad, Nabopolassar, because
Hmm.
he went out in the field because I guess he was getting nearing death for some reason. He died, I think, in 605. Nabopolassar did. So Nebuchadnezzar ascends not just because of his father's passing, but also because of his military prowess and taking over all these lands. And so he defeats the Assyrians and the Egyptians combined because they're both fighting together at Carchemish. And he kind of asserts his dominance over the region.
Yeah.
And of course, everybody has heard of Nebuchadnezzar, probably. But if you haven't, you can Google him and figure it out. Now, so Habakkuk, again, he's supposed to call people back to the covenant and its laws. And he's saying, well, God, you're not, holding up your side of the covenant. You're not enforcing all these things that I can call them back to. And then he says, now you're saying you're going to call the Babylonians in. And now look what they do. It says in verse 7, it says that they're a law unto themselves and that they promote their own honor. And then in verse 11, it says their own strength is their
Yeah.
God. And he's like, so this is the solution that since you're not holding it up, this is what's going to.
Yeah, like we just got finished with Nahum, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's all about how Nineveh, the Assyrians, abuse their power and they're cruel. And Habakkuk's, upset about that. And God says, the solution is another people who abuse their power and they're cruel and they worship, they worship their strength.
Yeah, it's nuts. Well, so Habakkuk, he's sitting presumably in Jerusalem because there is no more northern kingdom, and how does he react to this news? That God's saying, "Oh, I'll just send the Babylonians, then you'll see how great it'll be."
Yeah. So in verses 12 through 17, he says, "Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? You have made people like the fish in the sea, like the sea creatures that have no ruler. The wicked foe pulls all of them up with hooks. He catches them in his net. He gathers them up in his dragnet, and so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore, he sacrifices to his net and burns incense to his dragnet, for by his net he lives in luxury and enjoys the choicest food. Is he to keep on emptying his net, destroying nations without mercy?"
So this is a crazy little tale here. So Babylon is just wiping people out, taking all the plunder for themselves. And, he's saying, God, how can you look at this? Like, you can't look on this and approve of it. So how do you let this keep happening? And meanwhile, these people are pulling in this analogy saying like catching fish in a net, and then they're praising and worshiping the net instead of God who's given them the power, like we talked about in Nahum last week,
Yeah.
So,
And right, so they're worshiping the net here is the sword, really. Like
yes.
they conquer everybody, and they're like, that must be it right there. It actually reminds me of to do sort of a literary tie-in, but they use the term literature very loosely there. I've actually I've read the the Song of Ice and Fire, the Game of Thrones books. Don't necessarily recommend that. The first one's pretty good, even though it deals with sex and violence. So does the Bible, right? But there's a character in there who tells this story to illustrate his point, and he says, so there's a king, a priest, and a rich man, and they're in a room with a soldier, and they're each trying to get the soldier to kill the other two to serve him, make him the ruler of the land. And the priest appeals to the gods, to religion. That's why the soldier should serve him. And the wealthy man tries to bribe him with money, and the king asserts his authority. He says, "Well, I'm the king. You have to serve me." And then the question is, so who's the most powerful man in the room? and that some of the characters in the situation, they don't get it, and they're like, is it they all answer based on what they value. It's the money, right? It's the wealthy guy. Yeah, he that must be the most powerful because that's what they would do. But the trick is, it's the guy with the sword who's the most powerful. It reminds me of that. It's like, everybody's fighting over this, and like, well, this is true. The sword is true. I trust that, so that's going to be my God.
Hmm.
And it's like, you know, just like they're worshiping their own power, right? Their strength is their God.
Yeah. Yeah. He says they swallow. Why does God allow the wicked to swallow up those more righteous than themselves? Which is a interesting
Yeah,
question.
it's fair, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's one of the big questions is why do bad things happen to good people? Why do the
Hmm.
bad people get away with it, and why do they seem to have all the good stuff?
Yeah. And then it ends saying that they show no mercy.
Hmm.
So they don't thank God. They thank their nets with their sword. And then they show no mercy to anybody. So there's nothing about it that's godly. And so to summarize, like Habakkuk, he's watching this carnage, and all he can do is wait. Like, what else can he do? He can just sit there and wait because he's kind of like the priest in that room, right? He doesn't have the sword.
Yeah, yeah.
And he's like, well, I guess I'll just wait. I don't know what else to
See
do.
what happens. Yeah.
Yeah. But he does have a plan. So here's his plan. Habakkuk 2, verse 1 says, I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint.
That's interesting because it's kind of like, what answer do I give to the complaint? Like, he's hearing it from other people as well.
Yeah, he's representing the people.
He's just the go-between.
Yes, yeah. And he knows, like, I know I'm supposed to tell everybody to just obey the covenant, but it's all upside down.
Yeah, what do we
So
do?
now what else are you going to tell me? I'm running out of good things that anybody's going to listen to.
Yeah, I like here when he says, I'll stand at my watch, I'll station myself on the ramparts. That should remind you of Ezekiel, right?
Yeah.
Where God keeps telling him, you're the watchman.
Mhm.
You're getting this message. Your job is to tell people, even if they don't listen. That's their problem. The watchman still has to do his job.
Mm-hmm.
And Habakkuk is, in that tradition. That's kind of the two things that the prophets do. They call back to the covenant, and they just kind of stand there and keep watch.
I think that's good advice too. I think like when you don't know what else to do, just do what you know. Like do what you know you're supposed to do. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
When everything's falling down around you, just keep doing what you've been asked to do, and fight through it.
That's let me quote a real work of literature here in
The Bible.
yeah, almost.
Okay, what?
The Lord of the Rings.
Oh, okay.
When Éomer asks Aragorn, this is not in the movies. He says, "How is a man to judge between good and evil in such times? Because their world's spiraling into war and chaos. They don't know if they can trust people they meet on the road." And Aragorn says, the same as he always has: good and evil haven't changed since yesteryear. Like it doesn't. Okay, well, just because your situation's worse this year doesn't mean what's good has changed. You still do what's good. If it's good yesterday, it's good today.
Yeah, that's
if
good.
it's good in Rohan, it's good in Gondor. If it's good in America, it's good in Israel. God doesn't change, and He's the standard. So you still do what He's given you to do.
Yeah, and I think that's a good answer from Habakkuk, given nothing else. I mean, this is what David did, right? Like when he went to the cave at Adullam, he waited for a word from God.
Yeah,
and what he was supposed to do next. So yeah, we've seen that several different characters.
The Psalms are full of waiting. We were looking through earlier trying to find one to add in, but
a perfect one.
I mean, you could just there were dozens of examples.
So this is his complaint now back to God, and he's like, I'm just going to have to wait. And so what does God reply back? In Habakkuk 2, verses 2 through 5, it says, Then the Lord replied, Write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. See, the enemy is puffed up. His desires are not upright, but the righteous person will live by his faithfulness. Indeed, wine betrays him. He is arrogant and never at rest, because he is as greedy as the grave, and like death is never satisfied. He gathers to himself all the nations and takes captive all the peoples. He's saying, just trust in the Lord, right? And he's going to rescue you in time. And it's gonna come fast. You're not gonna believe what happens, like he told him earlier. So it's sort of like those passages where in the New Testament where it talks about they come suddenly in the night. So make sure you're ready.
Yeah.
Just don't give up and quit being prepared because it's gonna come and you'll take you unaware.
It's interesting. He talks about the wicked person getting puffed up while God delays. Kind of like the delay from God, the silence and the inaction is like a bluff.
Yeah.
It's like a poker game. Like if you're the really good player in the room is kind of quiet, waiting to see
Yeah.
what people do. The guy who's overconfident, full of himself, starts getting more aggressive, and like that's what happens here with the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the nations. They're all devouring each other. They're all getting puffed up, trusting in their own strength. And God's answer to Habakkuk is wait, like just be faithful.
Yes.
I'm flushing everybody out. This is the weeder class when you take psychology 101. Everybody declares as a psych major. Then they're like, all right, let's figure out who's serious. We're gonna fail half of you.
Yeah, you're right. So the wicked person gets puffed up when they have to wait, and when God doesn't seem to be acting because they think, aha, God doesn't actually smash people who do all this stuff. I can just do it with impunity.
Yeah.
And then the good person, the righteous person, right? They remain faithful even though God hasn't seemed to act. They're like, well, I still trust him. I'm going to trust in his power, like we talked about in the last episode, and I'm going to wait and I'm going to remain faithful. And those people find life. It says
You can go out right now and commit some heinous sin, and probably like a piano is not going to fall on you from the sky, like in Looney Tunes.
right.
And you might think, I guess there's no consequences.
Yeah.
It's like Eve takes the fruit, right? The serpent gets her to take it, and she kind of looks at it and like, nothing happened. It looks good, so maybe I can just get away with this.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, because I think the point is though that what the lesson from this is that okay, there's always going to be times when God is patient, delays his judgment, but that doesn't change the nature and character of God. That's part of his goodness. So you talked about in the Nahum episode, and so when you experience God's goodness, if you're a righteous person, that makes you more faithful. You're like, oh, good, God's waiting, less people will die, right? But then the wicked person sees it as an opportunity to kill more people and take their stuff. But the point, though, I think of the whole lesson is going to be, well, just like in Job, it's like no matter what circumstances you find yourself in, you always do the right thing. Doesn't matter if you're put upon, doesn't matter if you're the winner, the loser, you always do what's right.
Another interesting point here is in verse 5, right? It says that the wicked man is greedy as the grave, like death he's never satisfied, right? So there's no difference between the arrogant wicked person and death.
Yes.
He's already there. He's 1 foot in the grave.
Yeah, you have more in common with death than with life if you're treating people like this. That's, I think, a really strong message in here. And, it says that he literally is collecting people. Like
he gathers all nations,
like
and all
the
people.
grave gathers people, because everybody everywhere dies, and it's like you're just like the grave. So like you're it's kind of ghoulish, but righteous people, like we have to act on our faith. We have to remain faithful and act on it. And it's kind of similar, like if you remember when Elijah was reprimanded by God. Like he runs away and hides. After he has this big victory, he runs away and he hides in a cave.
Yeah.
And God comes and finds him. And in 1 Kings 19:9, second half of that verse says, and the word of the Lord came to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? He replied, well, I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left. And now they're trying to kill me too. So that's kind of like his complaint, similar to Habakkuk's complaint, like what was happening around me. The Lord said, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then the voice said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? Same question. See if it's the same answer. He replied, I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too. It's exactly
Yeah.
verbatim. The Lord said to him, go back the way you came. I was like, why didn't you even come here? He's like, just go back. Just go back where you were. And go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king over Israel. And anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, from Abel Meholah, to succeed you as prophet. Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escape the sword of Jehu. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and whose mouths have not kissed him. So,
Kind of an interesting response there.
yeah. Well, it's like Elisha wanted to hide in a cave and complain, because things weren't going well. And God says, well, why aren't you out just doing your job? It's like, you're supposed to be doing what I told you to do. And furthermore, I got 7,000 people. You're not the only one left. I got 7,000 more just like you, who were faithful to me. So stop with the pity party here.
And he's saying, I can raise up these kings here who are not like he has him go anoint the king of Aram. That's not even the chosen people. Like go anoint these kings. I'm going to use them to enact justice on the people that you're complaining about.
Yeah,
And
it's interesting, right? Because it's not like these are things like, no, okay, you should have just been, cooking your meals and keeping your house clean and stuff like that. It's not like these minor things that you're supposed to, he's like, here's some major stuff you got to do. Go anoint 3 kings and change the balance of power in the world.
I think this is really, really potent right now in American Christianity. Like what Elijah does here is the conservative tendency. Like we see all the cultural problems in our country. We see that even infiltrating the church. And then we just want to run away. We're like, well, whoever's faithful, we just need to run away and hide. And we just make a new church, in a shopping mall or something.
And we paint that as faithfulness.
Yeah. And it's like, we're going to run away and we're going to isolate over
Yeah.
here. And it's really weak. Like there's one really, really strong example. And it applies to really all branches of American Christianity right now. So I'm not picking on them, but to use like the Methodist Church as an example, they just split earlier this year, right? They just fractured over the issue of gay marriage. A few years ago, they had a referendum on gay marriage. Like, are we gonna perform gay marriages? And they voted no. Like the people voted no as a majority. And then the conservatives freaked out and ran away. It's exactly what Elijah did. He won because he's just had the big epic confrontation on Mount Carmel with like 400 priests of Baal, and they can't get Baal to light the fire, probably because he doesn't exist. And Elisha's like, oh yeah, I'm going to douse my altar in water, and God's still going to consume everything. Even the stones, which are not flammable, burn up. And everybody's like, that's crazy. And then he kills the prophets of Baal, and then he runs away and hides in a cave. And it's like, what? You have like, and here's the example: you have 7,000 people. You have all these people, and this is for every denomination, right? But we tend to just split and fracture off and go isolate ourselves. You have all these people who are faithful. If you work together, maybe you'll actually be able to affect the change that you want instead of going and hiding in caves or starting a new, start the, some cheesy sounding name, the, Elevation Church or something like in out of that little, store in the side of a strip mall. Like,
well, I mean, it could be kind of like the Book of James too. Like in the New Testament, like you show me your faith without acts, and I'll my acts will show you my faith.
Exactly.
Like he's telling Elijah, Elijah, go out and do the stuff I told you to do. Like that's what faithfulness is like listening to me. And
yeah, and it has to be active, right? A faith that only is an assent to the facts that God exists, as James says, even which we're getting ahead of ourselves in the New Testament.
No, that's okay.
Even the demons have that. Like the demons recognize, well, God exists. He's the authority of the universe. I just don't like that, so I'm going to oppose him.
Yeah.
And if you're not doing the works he set out for you, then you're not much better than the demons.
Yeah. The point is that the instinct of the prophet is correct. Maintain covenant in all circumstances. Even though, like Habakkuk and Nahum too, from last episode, were both like, how is that supposed to happen in these circumstances? And it's like, it doesn't matter. It's like the circumstances. What's that have to do with it? It's like we talked about in Job, circumstances have nothing to do with it. Just remain faithful and do what you're supposed to do. Like he does, I'm going to be a watchman. I'm going to wait for a word and I'm going to give it to everybody to save everyone. So
yeah, like the Ten Commandments don't say, have no other gods before me unless the priests of Baal are going to kill you. I guess you can compromise on that one. It doesn't matter the circumstance.
Now God does answer him back about, look, Babylon's going to be taken care of. Okay, if they are abusive, this is what will happen to them, the same as what happened to Assyria and Nineveh. So he has a series of woes, these 5 different woes, you could say, in Habakkuk chapter 2 that he goes through. And I'll start with the first one in verses 6 through 8. It says, will not all of them taunt him? He's talking about the people that have been taken into captivity by them, and that we were talking about a moment ago, all the different cities and countries. And so he says, will not all of them taunt him with ridicule and scorn, saying, woe to him who piles up stolen goods and makes himself wealthy by extortion? How long must this go on? Will not your creditors suddenly arise? Will they not wake up and make you tremble? Then you will become their prey. Because you have plundered many nations, the peoples who are left will plunder you. For you have shed human blood. You have destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. The obvious thing that he's saying is that it doesn't matter, if you think that God's not upholding the law, or that you shouldn't have to hold up the covenant. Like, look at these 2 parts of the covenant here, stealing and murder. All right, they're both dealt with in this passage. And he's saying, well, okay, what happens if no one abides by don't steal and don't murder? All the people you've been stealing from are going to turn around and go, wait, why are we letting this guy steal our stuff? Let's go plunder him and get it back, right? And all the people you've been murdering, their family members are going to come and say, let's kill them because they killed all of our family members, right? Yeah. It's the same thing that God gave the law to protect us against, for things running out of control. And what Habakkuk is saying here is, look, don't you know that if you totally disregard God's laws, you're going to live in the consequences of that, which is no peace anywhere. So he is fulfilling the role of the prophet here by saying, hey, we've got to remember, don't steal, don't murder. Things go bad when you do that. And the Babylonians, they don't care. They're not listening.
Yeah. So the next woe, right, is verses 9 through 11. Woe to him who builds his house by unjust gain, setting his nest on high to escape the clutches of ruin. You have plotted the ruin of many peoples, shaming your own house and forfeiting your life. The stones of the wall will cry out, and the beams of the woodwork will echo it. It's like, I kind of reminded of like Haman, right? Where he's like, they go to his house and like, oh, well, he's built this whole stake to execute Mordecai. And then what was it in that law, right? That I hope I'm remembering that, because I just thought of this right now off the top of my head. It's that story, right? Where or is it in Daniel with worshiping the king of Persia, where anyone who breaks it, a beam is pulled out of their house
and thrust through them. Yeah. I don't think that was Haman's thing. Haman was just that all the Jews should die.
Right, but then once the king of Persia realizes what's happening, he reverses it, and he's like, anyone who opposes, once he's making the law on the behalf of the Jews.
I think that was Daniel's king.
Okay, yeah.
Daniel's God.
Yeah, when he's like, you can only pray to Daniel's God, and anyone who refutes that will pull a beam out of his house and impale him on it. It's like, whoa. And here we kind of a similar thing where like the man's own house is plotting against him.
Yeah. To me, it reminded me of Proverbs 1, which we're not going to go read, but if you want to go read Proverbs 1, 8 through 19, there's a passage there where it talks about don't lay in wait with people to take somebody unawares and say, oh, that'll make us rich. I'll get rich that way. We'll kill him. Nobody will ever know. I mean, yeah, it's not, it's plundering, it's murdering, and it's just totally against, the covenant with God that we have. So, And then the third woe, Habakkuk 2, verses 12 through 14. Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and establishes a town by injustice. Has not the Lord Almighty determined that the people's labor is only fuel for the fire, that the nations exhaust themselves for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And I thought when I was listening to this, like a city built on bloodshed and injustice, a city built without God is built in vain, he's saying. It reminded me of Psalm 127, verse 1, which says, unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the guards stand watch in vain.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounded just like that to me, but I'm not sure.
No, I see the connection.
Yeah.
It's like the people's labor is fuel for the fire. Like your labor, it's just nothing. Like
Yes.
you put all that effort out, and it's just pointless.
Burned
It's just
like
gonna
stubble.
Be, everything you make is going to be destroyed. Okay. The fourth woe in Habakkuk 2, 15 through 17. Woe to him who gives drink to his neighbors, pouring it from the wineskin till they are drunk, so that he can gaze on their naked bodies. You will be filled with shame instead of glory. Now it is your turn. Drink and let your nakedness be exposed. The cup from the Lord's right hand is coming around to you, and disgrace will cover your glory. The violence you have done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, and your destruction of animals will terrify you. For you have shed human blood, and you have destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. That's kind of a callback to like Noah, right?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
With Ham.
Yeah, I think so. It could be. I mean, just the whole idea too of being drunk on power too, and terrifying the people in the land so that they are terrified of you and become irrational, and they run from you because of your great power. And so that's kind of a form of drunkenness too. And of course they ravaged people when they took over their lands and stuff. So that's all going to turn back around on them, and they'll have to drink the cup of God's wrath, just like the people who were being punished. Because God says he's using Assyria, he's using Babylon to do these things to punish people who didn't listen. And so, but that's going to come back around on them when they get drunk on that themselves.
All right, the final woe.
Habakkuk 2, 18 through 20 says, of what value is an idol carved by a craftsman, or an image that teaches lies? For the one who makes it trusts in his own creation. He makes idols that cannot speak. Woe to him who says to wood, come to life, or to lifeless stone, wake up. Can it give guidance? It is covered with gold and silver. There is no breath in it. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. So again, calling back to the 10 Commandments, right back to the graven image, no graven image.
Well, and where it says that he trusts in his own creation, just like we were saying, you're laboring in vain. Like your labor is fuel for the fire. Because if what you're making, if what you're doing is not for God, it's pointless. It'll be destroyed anyway.
It's this, that saying that it was said earlier, but they were a law unto themselves. I mean, that's what that is. You make your own God. It's like you're making up your own God. So
really,
you make a law to yourself.
It's been said I think I've even said this before. There's only two religions, right? Self-justification and Christ's justification, or being made in the image of God, or making God in your image. Those are really, at the end of the day, it all boils down into those two choices.
Yeah, and what this explicitly says is that when you make idols that can't speak, right, then you'll end up being the one who's silent before God. It's kind of like you've given up your right to speak before God if you wanted to say that was a God.
Right.
It's kind of it's a pun. It's a play on words. I mean, all of these had that. The plunderer is plundered. Here's the person who makes a mute idol becomes mute themselves. If you look in all 5 of the woes, they all have a juxtaposition like that. So, and in this one, it's trusting in man-made idols is the same as trusting in yourself, right? It's not in God.
Yeah.
So you're trying to.
Yeah, ultimately, yeah. That's why that's the way you look at the religion. Like you are trying to do it yourself. You've made this thing that you think will save you. And for, somebody who's just like an atheist today, they're not a pagan. Well, they're still ultimately in the same boat. Like they refuse God's justification. They refuse humility before him. So they're trying to do it on their own. I guess they might even be a step up because they're like, well, I'm not gonna make a fake one.
So Habakkuk 3, which we're not going to read in its entirety, is a big masterful psalm that Habakkuk writes about waiting on the Lord, and what he learned from this whole episode. And he talks about
He listened to this episode?
No, no, I don't know that he did or didn't, but anyway, the Lord who
impossible to verify. Sorry.
The Lord who led them out of Egypt, right? He talks about him into the promised land, who gave them the law. He talks about all of these things. He talks about in the imagery in his psalm. We're not going to read it, like I said, but here's the way that the psalm ends. This is the way the book ends in Habakkuk 3:16, second half of that verse through 19.
Yet I will wait patiently for the day of calamity to come on the nation invading us. Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails, and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen, and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to tread on the heights.
So that's kind of a cool ending. He learns to trust God. He learns to wait patiently for him and to act. He was waiting for God to act, but he also learns to do his job too while he's waiting.
So verse 18 stuck out to me there, where he says, "Yet I will rejoice in the Lord, and I will be joyful in God my Savior." Because listen to the opening lines of the Magnificat, Mary's song in Luke. "My soul glorifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior." Right? That's like a really similar line there.
Yeah, it is.
And
she may have read Habakkuk.
Yeah, or had it read to her.
All right, so we see there then God is not going to delay his justice forever, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so in the meantime, Habakkuk learns that he needs to be faithful, joyful, and an active servant of God.
Yeah.
So that gets to our Old Testament takeaway, which is wait upon the Lord and remain faithful in all circumstances. And that was something I didn't bring up in this last passage we read. It talks about all the different circumstances. There's no sheep, there's no olive oil, there's no, all the different things that it mentioned in that. You're missing every good thing, but it doesn't matter. Regardless, you still need to be faithful in that day of calamity. All right, so now we're going to turn to the New Testament. We're going to see, is this concept that we see in Habakkuk, where you just have to wait on God, and then Habakkuk doesn't get the message that he wanted at first, and then how does he react to that? So we're going to see what happens in the New Testament in similar situations. So we're going to start in Luke 4, verses 14 through 22. It says, Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread through the whole countryside. He was teaching in their synagogues, and everyone praised him. He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. He began by saying to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his lips. "Isn't this Joseph's son?" They asked. So he starts out, Caleb, when he's talking about this passage, obviously a similar situation to that they're in, being under the thumb of Rome.
Mm-hmm.
And, they're like, well, Habakkuk was in the same situation under the thumb of Assyria. And he's like, God, how long is this going to take? And so Jesus is reading this passage saying, this is happening right now. We're going to get freed from oppression.
Yeah.
And so everybody's like, this is great. I love this guy, right? And so
Then
that's
they
sort
ask,
of like
isn't
when,
this Joseph's son?
yeah, but still, it's the same as like with Habakkuk when God answers him. He goes, "Oh no, I'm going to do something you've never seen Nobody's ever seen anything like it. And he's like, all right, this is going to be great. And then God tells Habakkuk, well, I'm going to send the Babylonians to save you, right? So let's see what happens, with Jesus, because they love the beginning of his answer. But then Jesus kind of does what his father did, right? He continues and he says, Luke 4:14 through 30, Jesus said to them, surely you will quote this proverb to me, physician, heal yourself. And you will tell me, do here in your hometown what we have heard that you did in Capernaum. Truly I tell you, he continued, no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years, and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath, in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet, yet none of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian. All the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. They got up, drove him out of the town, and took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built, in order to throw him off the cliff. But he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. So I sort of hear an echo of Habakkuk here because Habakkuk tells God, hey, all of your covenants upside down, and none of it's working the way I want. Mm-hmm. And they say, he's telling them, well, you're going to tell me, why don't you do all the amazing miracles you were doing over in Capernaum? That's what we want to see. And we want to see you do God-like things. Same thing Habakkuk was saying. Where's the God-like action? Why is God not acting? And Jesus saying, yeah, I know what you want. You want me to do that, but you're not going to accept me if I do. It's going to be just like, I'm going to have to go to the Gentiles. Mm-hmm. The Gentiles will listen, but you won't. And man,
they like that one.
Yeah, that caused a little bit of consternation, which is the same thing God said when he said, I'm going to get the Babylonians to help.
Yeah. Really? You going to use those guys?
Yeah. It's interesting to ponder, like, Jesus was giving the same kind of answer God gave to Habakkuk. Like, well, hold on, we got to wait. The Gentiles have to get involved here. And, Habakkuk was smart enough to kind of like, I'll give this a chance, But in the case of Jesus' crowd, they were a little more hostile.
Yeah. So we see a similar reaction in Matthew 12, verses 14 through 21, after Jesus heals a man with a shriveled hand on the Sabbath. But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. Aware of this, Jesus withdrew from that place. A large crowd followed him, and he healed all who were ill. He warned them not to tell others about him. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. Here is my servant, whom I have chosen, the one I love, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations. He will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out, till he has brought justice through to victory. In his name the nations will put their hope.
So yeah, here in quoting Isaiah 42, verses 1 through 4, kind of see that Jesus' ministry is about bringing justice to all the nations, right?
And hope.
Yeah, and that was a theme that we saw in Habakkuk, is where's God's justice?
I think the bruised reed and smoldering wick there are like the nations, right? Like Habakkuk wants to see them destroyed, right? The Jews want to see the Gentiles destroyed. And even though they're like a bruised reed or a smoldering candle, not much good for anything anymore, like God has patience, like we saw in Nahum or here. Like he's having patience, which is part of his goodness. And so he's not just going to snuff them out. He's still going to work through them and with them as well.
Yeah,
because it does say until he's brought justice through to victory. So like the vengeance is coming, right, on those who are not accepting God, but he has patience on them.
Yeah, and I think it's like, from an unexpected place, you wouldn't expect, like the smoldering wick or the bruised reed to be strong. Like it's not, you're not trusting in power, like we saw in the Old Testament passages there. But here it's like the weak, are being exalted.
Yeah, well, we saw in Amos, I think, talking about how because the strong sheep abused the weaker sheep, he's going to kill the strong sheep and use all the sick, weak sheep
Yeah.
as to build the herd again, which is like the opposite of what you think you're supposed to do.
Yeah. Okay, so I wanted to go into Matthew 23 because there's a series of woes that Jesus declares against the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. And I thought it was very similar to what we had just read, the series of woes that we saw in the book of Habakkuk. So let me read through this really quick and then we'll talk about it. This is Matthew 23:13 through 39. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You travel over land and sea to win a single convert, and when you have succeeded, you make them twice as much a child of hell as you are. Woe to you, blind guides! You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing, but anyone who swears by the gold of the temple is bound by that oath. You blind fools, which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? You also say, if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing, but if anyone who swears by the gift on the altar is bound by that oath. You blind men, which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? Therefore, anyone who swears by the altar swears by it and everything on it. And anyone who swears by the temple swears by it and by the one who dwells in it. And anyone who swears by heaven swears by God's throne and by the one who sits on it. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat but swallow a camel. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside will also be clean. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You build tombs for the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous. And you say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are the descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Go ahead then and complete what your ancestors started. So I just thought it was really similar to Habakkuk. In the case, you can see why the Pharisees would have hated this, because in Habakkuk, he was forecasting woes against Babylon. And here Jesus is doing the same thing to them. But I noticed he's also talking about like how they collect the bones of the dead and things, and some of these, just like some of Habakkuk's.
He calls them, whitewashed tombs.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're inside, they're full of decay. Like Habakkuk made no distinction between the arrogant and the grave.
Death, death and grave. So, and remember how a wicked person gets puffed up when God delays. And here right before this section, he had a section about verses 1 through 12, hypocrisy and humility, and calling people to humility, not to act the way that the Pharisees do, and in their self-righteousness. And so remember that a person gets puffed up when God delays, and here I think is happening the same thing. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees, they've become puffed up, showing that their true nature is not that they are righteous, but rather wicked. And Jesus is calling them out for that, for their hypocrisy and their lack of humility.
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to, the people, the Jews were waiting under Rome, waiting for the Messiah, right? And the justice, mercy, and faithfulness, like Jesus said, you should have practiced that.
Yeah, while they were
without
waiting.
neglecting the tithing and things of that nature.
Yeah, I really think verse 23 is the hinge of this whole, the center of that. Yeah. And it's the same as what Habakkuk was focusing on, justice, mercy, and faithfulness, yeah.
And they should have practiced that in all circumstances, like we saw with Habakkuk, or going back to Job even.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And we can't go to every single passage, but there are several passages that quote Habakkuk, and particularly Habakkuk 2:4, I think it is. But Paul quotes it in Romans 1, verses 16 through 17. He says, I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. For in the gospel, a righteousness from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. So,
Which he's quoting Habakkuk there, right?
yes.
And like we were saying, it's the things that you do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the Pharisees gave all kinds of verbal and intellectual assent, but they're not doing any of it. They're not actually living it. And that's why Jesus calls them children of hell.
Yeah, it's pretty brutal.
Like James saying that the demons have that kind of faith. So what good is that?
Yeah, well, that's another example of equating them with death,
Right?
Just like Habakkuk did. So I really think Jesus had Habakkuk in mind when he came up with those woes against the Pharisees. But there's good news in this too, right? That Habakkuk was that justice was on the way, and now in Jesus it's like, well, justice is here, and justice is found in Jesus Christ, and so that gets us to our New Testament takeaway.
A Christ follower practices justice, mercy, and faithfulness in all circumstances.
Yeah, so that's a high calling right there.
Mm-hmm.
We're following Christ. We're none of us attaining it, I don't think. But in every single circumstance, to be able to practice justice, mercy, and faithfulness would be a great goal to set for your life and try to accomplish. And the promise with Christ is that there's no more waiting. You can start today. You can do it right now. You can start practicing that.
The kingdom of God is among you.
Yeah. And when you follow Jesus Christ, you will find justice.
Of course, we're still waiting on him to return again as judge.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
That's part of the work of the church is waiting faithfully. But we're walking in those acts of justice, mercy, and faithfulness as we wait.
Yeah. We're being called back to covenant, just like Habakkuk was calling the people to covenant. Christ calls us into covenant with him and to walk in mercy, justice, and faithfulness. So, well, he's Caleb and I'm Timothy, and thank you for listening to Bible Discussions on Biblocus, where the Bible intersects with your life. Please consider subscribing to our channel to help support our efforts here. All scripture quotations, unless otherwise indicated, are taken from the Holy Bible, New International Version, NIV, copyright by Biblica Inc., used by permission of Zondervan. All rights reserved. This program is copyright 2024 by Timothy Klingerman. God bless all of you.